to talk to that neighbor that is a real piece of work. Maybe it means being willing to say, I'm sorry to someone for something that you've done, that you knew you did wrong, and that you know you must repent of. Maybe it means putting yourself in a position where if God doesn't provide, you're sunk. I believe that God's stirring will almost always involve leaving behind of earthly comfort. And last, God's stirring will always lead to biblical worship. Remember that the primary task of the first wave of exiles leaving Babylon, going back into Jerusalem, was to build the house of the Lord, the center of biblical worship for God's people. That God's stirring was calling them to first and foremost return to biblical worship. If God has stirred your heart, then it will be absolutely necessary to worship. And by worship, what I mean is not just singing, but I am not excluding singing. Worship in the Christian mindset, worship from a biblical perspective, is all-inclusive and all-encompassing. In Romans chapter 12, we are given a vision of what this worship looks like, and it looks like the whole body, the whole soul, climbing up on the altar saying, "Here I am, God, use me, that I might be a living sacrifice for you." Everything about my life, inwardly, outwardly, physically, spiritually, everything about my life would be lived to the glory of God. That's biblical worship. Now, if worship in its fullest biblical sense is that encompassing, then it guaranteed involves your voice. The people of God will be returning to the house of the Lord to sing the praises of God. Psalm 13, verse 6. I will sing to the Lord because He has dealt bountifully with me. Do you believe that God has dealt bountifully with you? Meaning, if you take a step back and evaluate your life, and you remove everything in your life that you have received by the grace and the mercy of God, what would your life look like? Well, I can guarantee you, you wouldn't be here today, first and foremost. You may not even be alive today. And if you have received the bounty of God, if your soul has been stirred to appreciate His grace and His mercy, then how can you help from singing His praise? And I hear this a lot. Well, Pastor, I don't sing. You don't want to hear me sing. You don't want to hear my voice. Trust me, the people in the pew in front of me don't want to hear my voice. Please, please, please hear me. If God has dealt bountifully with you, then God has not only commanded you, but He is inviting you to sing His praise. I would love it if every person in our church in McLeod, if every Christian in the world would decide that they are not going to allow the standards of harmony and being on pitch decide whether or not they're going to worship. Not everyone was blessed with perfect pitch, but every believer has been blessed with a reason to praise God. I just want to read you one quick quote from this wonderful little book by Keith and Kristen Getty called Sing. And if you want, I know that this book is in our library. I have a copy. I would love for you to borrow it, to read it. If you struggle to sing, for a variety of reasons, if you struggle to sing, and you know what, actually, I find the people that tell me they struggle to sing, they were told, most of them were told as a little kid by someone, maybe a music teacher or even a Sunday school teacher or somebody in their life, well, you should sing quieter and in the back. I've heard people tell me that. I've heard hundreds of Christians over the years tell me that that's when they began to wonder if they shouldn't sing at all. Shame on those adults for saying that. Listen to this. We will spend our eternity singing, for the gospel compels us to sing. And we are a people who, as we reflect on the gospel cannot help but sing. We do not sing because we have to. We sing because we love to. That's only true if God has stirred your soul. Now, I told you that was the main application on the very first point. My sermon is not over. Let's continue. The second truth presented to us here in verse 5 is that God does not need large numbers of people to accomplish His purposes. In Judges chapter 7, verses 1 through 7, we hear about Gideon and Gideon's small band. In fact, Gideon had thousands, and God said, nope, that's too many. I can't win this fight with all those people. Gideon said, what are you talking about? And God says, no, send some of these people home. Send them home. I'm not going to win this battle with all these people. And Gideon, as a general, is wondering, how in the world are we going to win a battle with less people? That's not how it works, God. And God, in His might and majesty, whittled that number down to 300. The original 300. Forget about Thermopylae. Forget about the stand of those warriors in Sparta against the Persian army. This is the original 300 where God said, you bring those 300, but I will fight the battle. I will win. You can read about that in Judges 7, 1 through 7. Without a doubt, God can accomplish great things without any help or participation from His creation. So why then does God desire to accomplish things with a small group rather than a huge army? I think the reason is that in accomplishing His purposes with what looks to be, from a human perspective, like absolute weakness, it is a guarantee that God alone will get the glory. That's what God desires above all else, that we would look to Him as the victor and not ourselves. It's also important here in verse 5 to take note of the tribes that are mentioned. Judah, Benjamin, and the priestly tribe of Levi, they represent the remnant or the small remaining nation of Israel. In fact, the Old Testament gives no more information about the fate of the other tribes of Israel anywhere. Meaning, of all the tribes of Israel, these are the only ones left. And yet this remnant still, in God's terms, is the continuity, the continuation of the true nation of Israel. They may have ceased to exist, these other tribes, through disease or war or famine. Most likely it seems that they ceased to exist through intermarriage with other ethnicities and religious groups, which seems to be most likely, given that that is the main issue toward the end of the book of Ezra. But regardless of their fate, any vestige of Israel's covenantal heritage is now bound up in these three most important tribes of Israel: Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. Now we want to look at divine provision and restoration in verses 6 through 8. In verse 6 we read this: and all who are about them, meaning all the Babylonians, all those that lived around them, the non-Israelites, aided them with vessels of silver, with gold, with goods, with beasts, and with costly wares, besides all that was freely offered. Meaning they responded to King Cyrus's call that they would bless the people of God. Cyrus the king also brought out the vessels of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and placed in the house of his gods. Cyrus, king of Persia, brought these out in the charge of Mithridates, the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, there's those names I was talking about, the prince of Judah. Verse 6 tells us that the people of Babylon responded positively, and it recalls us back to the gifts of the Egyptians at that first Exodus, that first group of people that left Egypt, left bondage, and blessed them, the people of God, with silver and with gold to provide for them on their journey. But in addition to this, verse 7 goes on to tell us that the holy vessels that had been taken from the temple originally in Jerusalem when Babylon invaded had been now brought back and restored to Israel. These were the various items used as part of Israel's temple worship. These vessels demonstrate the continuity between the first temple and the renewed and rebuilt temple. In fact, these items, these holy vessels, are a demonstration, an example, an illustration of what God is doing with the people. These vessels, these holy vessels, are to point their direction, their eyes toward the direction of God's sustaining promise and restoration. Just like the vessels are being returned to their rightful place, the people are being returned to their rightful place. Returned to their rightful place, the people are being returned to their rightful place. You can read about the various items that were returned or would have been returned at the end of Exodus, beginning in chapter 37 through the end of that book. The various elements, the candlestands, the tables, the basins, all of these things that would have been returned. Verse 7 also mentions that these items were taken to the house of the Lord by the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. And we know that you may be familiar with the story. We know what happened with these in Daniel chapter 5. You can turn there if you like. Daniel chapter 5, just the first 4 verses, gives us a little clue as to what happened with these vessels. It says here, verse 1 of chapter 5 in Daniel, King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded, now Belshazzar is the son of, that the king and the lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. When they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. In other words, they were mocking the God of Israel. They were blaspheming the name of God. And it matters not that they thought that Yahweh was the same as their other gods. It doesn't a lick that they didn't take Yahweh seriously. Yahweh is to be taken seriously. Whether they recognize it or not, God will make sure that He is taken seriously. And immediately following that, we see this famous scene where a miraculous and mysterious hand appears on the wall and begins to write words that are unknown to the son of Nebuchadnezzar, this blasphemer. And we know that they call then Daniel to interpret these words, and Daniel says, "You have been weighed and found wanting." In other words, you for your blaspheming. God has judged you for taking Him. And now these vessels that had been profaned and blasphemed by these idolaters are now being returned to their rightful place, to the people of God, to go into a rebuilt, renewed, and restored temple. God is patient. God is not mocked. Though it may seem for a moment like mankind and evil has gotten its way, God will win. It may not be in your lifetime, it may not be in my lifetime. We may not witness it with our own eyes, but our children, our grandchildren, and those left on earth when Christ returns will bow their knee to Jesus without fail. The value of these items was so important to God that He ensures that those involved in handing them out and taking them take great care to invoice and account for them because of their great worth. Now, these two names, Sheshbazzar, we don't know exactly who Sheshbazzar is. We know that first and foremost, this treasurer, Mithradeth, he was the Persian treasurer in charge of giving these things out. Basically, he was going to keep an account of what was in the treasury and what was handed back out. But Sheshbazzar, though we don't know exactly who he is, some commentators say that he might be a descendant and heir of the former king of Judah, Jehoiakim. Some say that Zerubbabel, the leader of the first wave of Jews back to Jerusalem. Elsewhere, he is described as a governor or leader. That's in chapter 5, verse 14 of Ezra. Whoever this man is, Sheshbazzar, God takes great care to put the valuable temple items into the hands of a responsible and authoritative ruler over the people of God. In other words, this man is a steward of what God is given. And I would ask you, what vessels, what things of God that matter greatly to Him has He put you in trust of? What has He put into your care? God is 24 hours today. I would say it's a great gift. He may not have given you gold and silver, but He's given most of you a home and certain amounts of goods and financial resources. What are you doing with them? For some of you, He's given children and grandchildren, a spouse. How are you stewarding the greatest treasures that God has put into your care? I thought about this yesterday. We were with Rachel's family and a lot of eager junior high and high school kids from our old church in Redding to take her aunt's roof off to save money. Her aunt lost her husband, Rachel's uncle, unexpectedly a couple years ago. And so they're trying to sell the house. And so Zach and I went down there to do. Thank God there was a lot of other people there to share that load. That roof was off in record time. It was about 3.5 hours we had the roof come.